Unit 5, measurement and what the agent's obligations are when measuring property to get it prepared for the market. Our objectives in this section are at the end, we will have defined what living area is. That definition will be important to you. Above and below grade, they also test on that as well. So we'll discuss that. And then what do we mean by other area? There is actually a meaning to that. It's area that doesn't meet the primary definition of living area. So keep your eye on that as well. Quick question for you here. Are listing brokers required to measure a home? Most agents are actually surprised by the answer. The answer is that the Real Estate Commission, there's no obligation that an agent measure a home. However, if you do choose to represent a square footage, it must be accurate. Well, normally the agents, when they put a property into the MLS, they're going to be required to put the square footage in there. So technically, you're not required to measure by the Real Estate Commission, but you know you're going to have to do it because the MLS requires it if you put it in there, which is the most common thing to do with listings. So technically, you're going to measure it. And if you're going to measure it, it should be accurate. And if it's going to be accurate, you need to follow the rules that are laid down by the Real Estate Commission. They actually borrow from another organization, but they adopted these rules as their own. As a follow-up to that, are buyer's agents required to measure a home? And by now, you may recognize that the answer to that is no. You're not required to measure a home. However, keep in mind, buyer agent, if you walk into a home and you see that the measurement says 2,800 square feet, and you walk in and say, wow, I mean, this feels much smaller than this. You go to the listing agent and say, did you measure this? The listing agent, yes, fine, it's 2,800 square feet. If you're the buyer's agent and you honestly feel that it's not appropriate, you may have no choice but to measure it. Now, certainly buyer's agents are not going to be held to the same scrutiny that a listing agent will because they're only in the house one time. But if you're in there and it's off by several hundred square feet, as a diligent buyer's agent, you probably should pick that up. Listen, if it's a 2,800 square foot home and it's only off by 200 square feet, I doubt seriously if most buyer agents would pick that up with the naked eye. But if the representation is that it's 2,800 square feet and it's only 2,000 square feet, well, that's dramatic. Most of us would be able to pick up an 800 square foot difference just by walking into the house. Please note that this is an area that you will be tested on. You will need to understand that concept. I was telling you a moment ago that the commission does in fact have guidelines. They print a book. You could actually print this out from the website in black and white if you chose to. It might be a little bit easier to read, but it will tell you the rules that we're getting ready to go over. It's much more detailed than what we will go over here, but on the exam, this will probably only be good for 1 point on the exam. So we'll try to get you the information that you need for that. There are specific guidelines when agents say, well, it's kind of vague. It's not vague. The outlines are very, very specific. A couple of questions that you might want to take into consideration. I do want to answer these for you because they're important in the fact that they could affect a question or answer on the exam. Can I just use the tax records, blueprints, or previous listing? If you're an agent and that goes through your mind, well, what's wrong with just using the tax records? Well, tax records are notoriously wrong. I'm not saying they're always wrong, but they are notorious in that they are not accurate. Same thing for blueprints. A lot of people think, well, blueprints should be exactly right. But occasionally a builder will make adjustments on the fly, and it could affect what's the difference between the blueprint and what they actually built. They could run into a geologic structure or something, and they need to move the house a foot or an inch or whatever it is. Also, oftentimes the blueprints are measured differently. They are not measured the same way that we're required to measure the house. So it could come up with a different measurement on that. Or the previous listing. Could you use a previous listing? It was in the MLS before, and the MLS keeps records going back for several years. So having said that, why don't I just use the previous listing? Well, here's my question to you. How do you know the person who measured it before was accurate? So anyway, don't fall for any question on the exam that leads you to believe it's okay to use these items by themselves. Now, I want you to look at the next question, and I want to talk to you about how it's related to the first question. Even though I would not use the tax records as my measurement, you know what I do with the tax records? When I go out and I measure a home, I take that information back and I compare it to the tax records. If there is a notorious difference between the two of them, it makes me ask the question, well, were there improvements that were done that were never entered into the tax records? Is there an unpermitted improvement that might not count towards the final number? So I'm not saying I don't use the items in number one. I just don't use them as my representation when I put it into the MLS. I'm going to measure my house. Actually, there's another thought that's closely related to this as well. Busy agents often do not measure their houses. What they do is they hire someone with greater experience, someone like an appraiser, for example, who does this all the time. And the commission says, that's okay. Chris, if you want to take and hire someone to do your measurement, that's fine. But at the end of the day, I'm the one who puts it into the MLS. So I'm the one that's responsible for that number. If it's wrong, it falls back on me, not the person I had measured. They're not a member of the MLS. So make sure if you do use someone, it's someone that you can count on their accuracy. Also, if for some weird reason they just gave you some numbers and they were transposed, you should recognize that their numbers are wrong. In other words, if it's supposed to be 2,300 square feet and they tell you it's 3,200 square feet, you should recognize the discrepancy there and say, no, this is not a 3,200. Let's investigate and find out what we did wrong here. Also, when you're looking at the plan that the measurer drew for you, if you spot any problems with that, you should be able to recognize them. For example, if it's a two-story house and they assume that it was colonial, but you walk in and you realize that there's a two-story foyer, it's very possible that the appraiser did not deduct out the part on the second floor that did not have a floor. Okay, so a couple of issues there. You're not going to be tested that difficult on it. But what was my point on this? Agent, measure the house or have someone professional measure it. Don't use any other number that you're not responsible for, and then look at it and make sure that it makes sense. Finally, on this slide, we talk about above grade and below grade. Well, when we're talking about above grade on a property, on a house, the part that is above grade starts at the ground and goes up. That's above grade. The grade would be the ground, so to speak. Okay. Well, how do you know if something is below grade? The definition of below grade is any level of the house that is touched on one wall or more by dirt. The easiest thing to do is to picture a house that maybe goes off a slope on a hill and it has a basement. So when you approach the house, you actually only see one story from the road, but you know that there is a basement. The basement would be below grade. At least one of the walls is touched by dirt. Now, when you advertise this property, there may be 2,000 square feet up and 1,400 square feet in the basement. Let's assume that it's all finished, okay? You can actually advertise that house as a 3,400 square foot house, but you would need to denote, and you would want to make sure you represented to a potential buyer or buyer's agent that 1,400 square feet of that was below grade. Yes, it's 3,400 square feet, but 1,400 square feet is below grade. It could affect things such as appraisal, could affect livability of the house as well. When you're determining what square footage is, there is a very specific rule regarding that. If you like mnemonics, this is a mnemonic device here. Happy Feet Dance Always, HFDA. You say, what does that stand for? To qualify as living area, and if you're taking notes on this, you're going to want to circle the word living area. Living area is also known as heated living area, heated square footage. What we're talking about here is the part of the house where most of the living is done. Living area, heated square footage, okay? So here are the rules. For it to qualify for all of this, first of all, it has to be heated. And when we talk about a property being heated, we mean by some type of conventional means. Don't worry too much about it. We won't go into specifics on this, but what I mean by conventional means is that you can turn on a heating system. You could go away for 2 weeks and you could come back and it would still be functioning correctly. In other words, a heat pump would do that. A furnace would do that. I'm not talking about things like a log fireplace, okay? If you had a wood stove in your house, you would have to constantly be feeding it wood. It would not count as traditionally heated. So to qualify as heated living area, it first of all has to be heated. Makes sense, okay? It also, the F, it has to be finished. And again, I'm going to use the word traditionally finished. I don't want you to beat yourself up on this because on the exam it will not be difficult. But what we mean by traditionally finished is traditionally finished for indoor use. If you go down into the basement and the basement is unfinished, it's got bare walls, it's got open ceiling, rafters, not rafters, but joists, things like that, it's probably not finished. But if you go into the basement and they finished the floor, they've put down vinyl or carpet or something like that, they've put gypsum board on the walls, they've insulated where appropriate in the ceilings and things like that, I would consider that to be finished square footage. So it has to be heated, it has to be finished to qualify, and it also has to be directly accessible from another heated living area of the house. What that means is you walk directly from one heated area into another heated living area. Both of them count. Now, let me give you an example of where you often see a problem in this area, a couple of places. You may have someone that has a colonial, okay, so you know how to count it. Colonials are the easiest thing in the world to measure because they're just simply two boxes on top of each other. There's really no tricks. You measure the outside, the first floor, oftentimes you could just simply multiply by 2 and it would tell you the square footage. On this colonial, there is a garage, and in that garage, it has a finished room above the garage. It's been finished. They've put heat in there. It actually has a little bathroom, a little closet, and stuff like that. However, listen to this. What if that garage is a detached garage? Well, if it's detached, even though there's heated area above the garage, it's not going to count as living area. Why not? Because you can't walk out of one heated area into the detached garage. You're going to have to go out of the house, up into the garage, up those stairs, and that's how you'll reach the room. Now, oftentimes sellers don't understand this. The seller may say, well, that's just as nice as the rest of the house. Why can't you count that? It's not that you're not counting it. It does have value. It's just not heated living area. And there's no doubt the heated living area would certainly have a higher value per square foot in most cases. So to qualify as heated living area, here comes the test concept, okay? It has to have all 3 of these, not just your favorite 2. It has to be heated, finished, and directly accessible from another heated living area of the house to qualify as living area. That's your definition of living area. Now, let's look at how we're going to measure this house. Oh, let me go back on that. I'm sorry. Notice that this is in red, so this is absolutely going to be important. A house does not have to have an air condition to be considered a heated living area. I know it sounds intuitive when I say it that way. Well, of course, it doesn't have to have an air conditioner to be counted as heated living area. And depending on where you are in the country, it may or may not be common to have air conditioning, but don't worry about it. It's not required to count as heated living area. That actually in the past has been a standalone question. How do I measure a house? Let me go back to that real quickly. How do I measure a house? Here comes the first important step. In North Carolina, to measure a house, you actually do an exterior measurement. Now, think about that for just a moment. If you do an exterior measurement on a house, it automatically includes the thickness of the walls. Some people think, well, that's not fair. You should probably just take a measurement of the rooms and add them together, but that's not right. In North Carolina, we specifically say that it's okay to do an exterior measurement. And if you do an exterior measurement, it will necessarily include the thickness of the walls. Which is interesting because when you're measuring the second floor, sometimes you can't do an exterior measurement because it's odd shaped in relationship to the house. It may be offset a little bit on the corners or something to that effect. So you're not able to get up there. You may have a piece of the roof that's turned sideways or things like that. You can't get up there and measure it. So what you end up having to do often on the second floor is you have to do an interior measurement. Okay, listen closely. The rule allows for an exterior measurement. So what do you do if you have to go inside to measure the property? And here's the answer to the question. Anytime that you're doing an interior measurement, when you hit what would be considered an exterior wall, you add 6 inches. Why 6 inches? Because that's what the rule book says. So don't bother yourself, well, what if it's brick? What if it's vinyl? It doesn't matter. If you're doing an interior measurement to try to find out the overall heated living area of the house, and you have to do it inside, If you hit an exterior wall, add 6 inches to that wall. There's a real good chance you're going to have to add 6 inches to this wall as well. So instead of that room being 19 feet, it's going to be 19 feet plus 6 inches plus 6 inches. It'll be 20 feet long. And then you may end up having to do it on the side walls as well, depending on where the room is. How do I measure a house? It's an exterior measurement. Don't forget the 6-inch rule. If you have to go on the inside to do the measurement, just add 6 inches every time you hit an exterior wall. Some of the other things that come up, and these are a little bit complicated, but notice that we don't see any red flags here. So I don't think you're going to be tested on these. And part of the reason is, wow, it's hard to talk about some of these things rhetorically, okay? For example, there's a rule in regards to stairs. When you think about stairs and you look at a house, well, as you're looking at a house, if you're measuring and it's a 2-story house and there's a hole in the 2nd floor, well, if there's a hole, you actually have to subtract out that square footage, because if you can't walk on it, it's not going to count as square footage. Well, think about what happens with stairs. You had to cut a hole in the 2nd floor to get the stairs down. So what happens with the stairs, it's often said that you would add the stairs to the floor from which they descend. So it goes something like this, and don't worry, we're not going to ask you a math question on this. When you get in the field and start measuring, you will need to know this though. When a house has a set of stairs, we subtract out the hole where it is. It could be, I don't know, 15 by 15. It could be a staircase that also has an open area to the 1st floor. So let's say that that space is 15 by 15. So we subtract out 15 times 15, 225 square feet. We subtract that from the upstairs measurement that we got through the exterior measurement. Okay, subtract 225 square feet. But then we're going to add back in the square footage of the stairs. Maybe they're 4 feet wide and they have a run of 10 feet. So we add 40 feet back into the 2nd floor. So do you see what I'm talking about? Some of this stuff can be very, very complicated to hear. It makes much more sense if you're actually in the house measuring it. We're not going to ask you difficult test questions on that because it's so hard to ask a question on that. Bonus rooms. Think about a bonus room. When you walk into a bonus room, it often has sloped ceilings. So you say, okay, well, what's the deal with sloped ceilings? Now we get into a little bit of a bind because there's a rule. To qualify as heated living area, I didn't mention this to you earlier, but the room has to have a ceiling height of at least 7 feet for 50% of the room or more, okay? So when you walk into a bonus room, picture that. When I walk into my bonus room, I have high ceilings. They're at least 8 feet tall, not overly high, but I have ceilings that are regular height. And so anyway, in that room, I also have some sloped ceilings. Okay. So what I have to do in that particular room, the first question I ask myself is at least 50% of the room 7 feet or higher? In my bonus room, it's no problem. Clearly over 7 feet in most places. But then the other question is, what can I do in regards to these sloped ceilings? You will want to write this rule down. Okay. If you're in a room with sloped ceilings, you can count any square footage that has a ceiling height of at least 5 feet. So the first thing I did is I walked in and made sure at least 50% of the room was 7 feet or higher. And if it is, any portion of the room that has a ceiling height of at least 5 feet, and what I do is I go to the slope and I just simply drop a ruler down there, and at the point it reaches 5 feet, I mark it and say from here to here is going to be considered heated living area. If the ceiling drops down to below 5 feet, you can no longer count that. Very difficult, but the two numbers I want you to remember, to even qualify, it had to be at least 7 feet for 50% of the room. If it did qualify, I can actually measure down to 5 feet on the sloped ceiling. Attics would be the same way. So if you don't mind, I'm not going to beat you up too badly on that one. Just consider it almost like a bonus room. And then on the bay windows, don't concern yourself too much with this, but let me tell you why it comes up. There are really two types of bay windows that you may run into when you're measuring. And here's the way I describe it to students is I simply say, if you can stand inside the bay window, you're probably going to be able to count it as heated living area. But have you seen any of those bay windows that really it's just the window that juts out and it has kind of like a high windowsill seat you would not be able to count that because you can't stand in that, and it doesn't have a ceiling height of 7 feet. So you wouldn't be able to count it. It usually, a good bay window will usually add about 12 square feet for every bay window that there is of living area. But like I say, the one where the glass just juts out, that doesn't add any square footage. And then in regards to garages, watch out for test questions about garages, because garages typically are not finished. And if they are not finished, they would not count to the heated living area. I don't know if you've ever seen a house before that has a garage incorporated into the outline of the house, into the footprint of the house. Sometimes those trick agents, because they simply do length times width for the measurement, and they forget to subtract out the garage. Well, the garage is not heated, so you literally would have to subtract out that square footage from the overall living area. Most garages are not going to qualify as heated area. Even if you put up gypsum board on there, they still got that great big door that's not insulated. So it would be very rare that a garage would be considered heated. I mentioned this to you before. On the second floor, you always take this into consideration. If you can't walk on it, you can't count it. You remember earlier when I was talking about the stairs and I talked about open area to the second floor. What happens is if there's a hole, an opening in the second floor, you just simply subtract that from the measurement of the second floor. So in the example I gave you a little bit earlier, maybe it has 1,000 square feet downstairs, but the upstairs has a 15 by 15 hole. So instead of it being 1,000 square feet, it'd be 1,000 minus 215. And then remember, we added the stairs back in for 40 square feet. So it sounds like it's 175 plus, or it's 1,000 minus whatever it is. You can do math on that. So it'd be 1,000 on the first floor and less than 1,000 on the second floor, because there would be a hole in the wall and the floor. Okay, to be living area, I mentioned this rule just a moment ago. What height for ceilings? 7 foot. At least 50% of the room must be 7 foot or higher. Okay. Any exceptions? Well, the sloped ceiling rule. In the sloped ceiling rule, any part that is above 5 feet counts as long as they meet rule 1, the 7 foot rule. And then what does directly accessible mean? You walk out of one heated area directly into another heated living area. If you have to pass through an unheated area to get there, I don't care if it's heated on the other side of that, it's not going to count. Should we include items such as screen porches, garages, unfinished attics, and living area? You just simply ask yourself this question: is it heated, finished, and directly accessible? Let's go through those. Screen porches, I tell you what, if it's screened, it's not heated because it's not going to hold the heat in. Garages, I've already talked about, rarely are they finished. And the attic, it literally says that it is an unfinished attic. So if it's not finished, it clearly is not going to count. It has to meet all three of those rules. We're not going to review an actual problem right now. It will be included in your math video, so you'll actually get to see what a problem would look like. Let's skip it for right now, and we will revisit it in our math video. And then also just a couple of notes here. You may end up needing to make adjustments to back out porches or unfinished areas like the garage. Do you remember the example I gave you just a moment ago? If the garage was actually incorporated into the footprint, well, if it's not finished, and there's 1,800 square feet downstairs, but within that 1,800 square feet, there is a 20 by 20 garage, you would need to subtract out the 400 square feet. So the heated living area would only actually be 1,400 square feet in that case, okay? And then also occasionally you may end up having to calculate the area of a triangle. Well, when would you have to calculate the area of a triangle? Typically it would be on bay windows. If you think about a bay window, it's basically a rectangle with 2 triangles on the end. It's possible you might have to do that calculation. If you ever seen a turret oftentimes has triangles in it instead of rectangles. So occasionally you have to do that. By the way, let me throw this in on that note. You recognize when you start measuring things like turrets and bay windows and you're having to guess whether something's heated or not, the Real Estate Commission does not expect perfection. If you and I were both very talented measurers and we went out and measured the exact same house it is highly unlikely that we would come out with the exact same number. If I measured a house and an appraiser measured a house, it's highly unlikely that we would come out with the exact same number. The Real Estate Commission doesn't expect perfection. Matter of fact, I don't even know what perfection would be. Having said that, here's what the commission said. Not mistakes, deviations of up to 5% are really not considered to be inaccurate, okay? Now, this would assume that it's a slightly complicated house. If you go measure a double wide, and the double wide is 52 feet long by 28 feet deep, well, obviously, that's just a simple mathematic calculation. All of us should get pretty much the same thing on that. But when you start talking about measuring things like transitionals, contemporary houses, there are almost certainly going to be some weird angles, some weird ceiling heights. There's going to be some interpretations that need to make. So the commission says this: if an agent is off by no more than 5 feet, it's actually considered to be diligent if it's a relatively complicated house. Usually not going to be cause for concern if it's less than 5%. And that's actually in print in the little yellow book that I showed you earlier. Real quickly on land measurement, and then this chapter will be over. This is just to let you know that on the test, occasionally you will see a question having to do with land measurement that refers to a front foot. And when you say, well, what is a front foot? It is exactly what it sounds like. We get so used to talking about land in regards to acreage or square footage or something to that effect. But sometimes land has value because of the front footage. Look at it, what it says, the linear measurement of a property along the street. Well, think about when that has value. A front foot has value, especially if you're in a commercial corridor. And if it's commercial and it's on a busy highway, the most expensive part of the property is going to be the part that fronts the road. Because if you put a business there, you have ingress and egress. And so oftentimes there'll be a certain depth that they consider not only the front footage, but would be the commercial corridor or something to that effect. That's going to have more value than the part behind it that you have to drive through a service road, or if you have to drive through a parking lot to get to. So don't let the word front foot fool you. In the example that we show you here, the front foot is always going to be the first number. I refer to it as the width times depth in this particular case, but front foot will always be the first number. If I were to ask you in this case and say a tract of land sold for $800,000 and had 800 front feet, what would be the price per front foot? A lot of students freak out on this because they're like, oh my gosh, I've never evaluated. And they start trying to figure out how to do the square footage. And they say, well, there's not enough information here or something to that. But listen to the question again. This property sold for $800,000 and it had 800 front feet. So what was the value per front foot? Sounds to me like it was probably $1,000 per front foot. 1,000 times 800 would of course be 800,000. Okay. That is your measurement chapter. Keep it nice and simple, but guys, you got to know this. You have to know the definition of heated living area. You have to know how to determine heated living area. You also have to understand, above grade and below grade. Remember, those words were important as well. Ceiling height. Ceiling height is worth studying. You need to know the 7-foot rule, the 5-foot rule, not to do a measurement on the test, but just so that you'll know it. And then we introduce the word front foot, which some of you may never have heard of that referred to. That is the measurement section.